Elias Ward never planned to be a hero again. He just wanted silence. But the night he heard Ranger bark that single time, sharp, guttural, a command from some place older than fear, he realized the canyon wasn't empty. Someone had buried the truth in those cliffs, and his dog had just dug up the first breath of it. What happened next didn't just change Red Canyon. It dragged Elias back into a war he thought he'd left behind. And it all began with one bark. Elias Ward had imagined silence, not peace, not comfort, not some hallmark redemption arc, just silence. The kind a man could breathe without flinching. The kind that didn't carry the metallic echo of artillery or the panicked rasp of someone yelling for a medic. Red Canyon promised that kind of quiet. A stretch of broken desert cliffs carved by wind and time, miles from any paved road, the sort of place locals talked about with lowered voices. A place where memories went to disappear. Or so Elias had hoped. The cabin he bought for $200 sat crooked against a ridge of red stone, its roof bowed, its porch sagging like a tired spine. The deed had taken less than 10 minutes at the county office. The clerk barely looked at him. Another man, older, had adjusted his hat and murmured that some places didn't want to be lived in. No one stopped him. No one cared, except his dog. Ranger stepped through the doorway first, nose low, tail straight, every movement tight and economical. The German Shepherd was 9 now, muzzle dusted with grey, scars tracing his ribs like faint handwriting. But there was still something sharp in his posture, something that hadn't dulled since Afghanistan. Elias set his rucksack down, the sound too loud in the hollow room. Dust stirred. The sun dipped behind the canyon lip, turning the walls a deep bruise red. He rubbed a hand over his jaw and exhaled. Home, he told himself. Temporary or not, it was home. Then Ranger froze. Not a flinch, not a curious pause, a full-body lock, muscles coiled, head low, ears pinned back. A vibration rose from his chest, low and ancient, as if the canyon itself had exhaled through the dog. Elias straightened slowly. You good, buddy? Ranger didn't look at him. His eyes were fixed on the stone hearth in the corner of the room. The fireplace was cold, dark, lined with soot that looked older than the cabin itself. Nothing about it seemed unusual, a few loose stones, a thin layer of ash. But Ranger's stance said something else. Elias had seen that posture before. A lifetime ago. Kandahar. A half-collapsed schoolhouse. A hallway that smelled like diesel and sand. Ranger had stopped exactly like this. One paw raised, breathing slow, waiting for Elias to see what he already knew. IED under the floorboards, one step from oblivion. Elias felt that memory settle in his ribs like a weight. He approached the hearth, his boots scuffing lightly against the warped floorboards. Ranger's growl deepened. All right, he whispered, crouching. I'm just looking. The stones were cold, rough against his fingertips. Dust clung to his skin like chalk. He tapped one stone, then another. Dull, solid, normal. But the third stone on the bottom row gave a different sound. Not solid, not even hollow. Something in between, like the echo of a space meant to hide something. A chamber, maybe. Or a vault. Elias leaned closer. Ranger barked once, abrupt, hard, the kind of bark he only used when life hung on a thread. Elias jerked his hand back on instinct. The air in the cabin felt suddenly heavier, the cold shifting around him like it was carrying a warning. The wind moaned through the cracked window panes, but it wasn't the wind that made the hair on Elias's arms stand up. It was the certainty that Ranger wasn't reacting to the stone. He was reacting to what was behind it. Elias stood, crossed the room, and grabbed the crowbar he'd bought in town earlier that afternoon. The hardware clerk had made a joke about fixing up the place. Elias hadn't laughed. He returned to the hearth. Ranger shifted slightly, positioning himself between Elias and the door, as though guarding every possible angle. Elias pressed the crowbar into the seam. The first shove did nothing. The second loosened a line of mortar, darker than it should have been, like someone had sealed it recently. Too recently for a cabin abandoned for 20 years. One more push. The mortar snapped with a brittle crack, sharp as breaking bone. The stone shifted a fraction. Enough. Elias wedged the bar in deeper and leaned his weight into it. The slab slid free. Behind it was darkness. Not damp, not rotten, just still. Elias raised his flashlight, the beam slicing into the small cavity carved deep into the foundation. And there, resting carefully on the stone floor, was a narrow metal case, painted olive green. Military issue, older than Elias by at least a decade. Next to it lay a leather journal, warped and brittle at the edges. Ranger didn't move towards the opening. He simply stared at it, chest rising and falling with slow, deliberate breaths. But there was something in his eyes Elias hadn't seen in years. Recognition. Elias pulled the case from the cavity, the weight surprising him. He set it on the floor gently and reached for the journal. The leather crackled under his touch. He opened to the first page. Miles Keaton, June 3rd. Elias frowned. The name pulled at the edge of memory. Then it snapped into place. A missing person cold case. A geologist and freelance investigator who vanished in Red Canyon almost 20 years ago. His truck found abandoned, doors open, no blood, no body. Locals had offered theories: blizzard, mountain lion, suicide. But not one had ever mentioned a hidden stone or a sealed cavity. Elias turned another page. Words written tight, precise, urgent. Notes on water quality, soil readings, and something else. Something darker. They told me the canyon was empty. They told me not to dig. But I found what they buried, and they will come for me next. Elias looked up. Ranger met his gaze. Silent, unblinking, waiting. A sudden crack echoed outside the cabin. Sharp, clean. Not a falling branch, not an animal. A human bootstep breaking a crust of frozen dirt. Ranger whipped his head towards the door, posture rigid, growl ripping from his chest. Elias killed the flashlight. The cabin fell dark. Someone else was out there, someone who already knew what he had found. And in that moment, Elias understood one truth so clear it made his pulse thunder. He hadn't uncovered this secret. He had walked straight into it. The dark settled into the cabin like a second skin. Not quiet, watchful. Elias stayed low, one hand resting lightly on Ranger's back, feeling the dog's pulse hammer through muscle. The single footstep outside never repeated, but Ranger didn't relax. His ears tracked the silence like it was making noise only he could hear. Elias waited a full minute before he let himself breathe. The memory of the hollow stone pressed behind his ribs. He needed light, answers, something solid beneath his hands, anything that wasn't fear shaped like a canyon. When he flicked the flashlight back on, Ranger didn't flinch. He simply moved with Elias, positioning himself a half step ahead, the way he had done years ago under a different sky. Afghanistan returned without warning. A flash of sun on metal, the choking scent of diesel burning off hot sand, the faint click beneath his boot before Ranger slammed into him, knocking him sideways just as the trigger plate detonated. The blast had chewed a crater into the dirt where Elias had stood. Ranger had crawled from the rubble with his ears bleeding and his fur singed, and yet he had dragged Elias another 10 yards before collapsing. Memory hit with a weight Elias had never learned to control. His hand tightened around the flashlight. Ranger bumped his knee once, the grounding gesture he had learned after deployment, the one that said, "Stay here. Come back." Elias exhaled. The dog's instincts had saved him too many times to count. Tonight felt no different. He turned back to the cavity behind the hearth. The metal box sat where he had placed it, its green paint chipped, its hinges rusted but intact. Next to it, the 3 notebooks waited like relics. Ranger sniffed the air again, a short, controlled inhale, head tilted slightly as if tracing an invisible thread. "You smell something." Elias whispered it, but the dog didn't need words. His body angled towards the box like it carried both danger and truth. Elias lifted the first notebook. The leather cracked under his fingers, the years evident in every brittle corner. On the inside cover, the ink held firm. Miles Keaton. Field Notes. The name stirred a faint recollection. A missing person poster taped to a gas station window years ago, its edges curled by wind. A rumor overheard at a diner about a man who poked at the wrong land survey. Elias had dismissed it as small-town folklore. But here it was, in his hands, buried inside his cabin. Ranger let out a short breath, not a whine, not a warning. Something in between. Elias recognized it. That subtle exhale Ranger used when he had found something important, something that mattered. He opened the journal to the first real entry. Neat handwriting, scientific but urgent. June 3rd at small fissure on the North Ridge. Water sample foamed on contact with sunlight. Not natural. June 12th, 3rd, dead deer by the creek. Eyes filmed white. No scavengers touched the body. June 19th, someone followed me back from the ridge. Truck with no plates. Stayed back, but too steady to be random. The pages felt heavier as Elias turned them. Ranger nudged his elbow, pushing slightly, almost insistently, as if telling him to keep going. Another entry waited near the center, written in a harsher press of ink. July 1st, if something happens to me, it won't be an accident. Elias sat back, the words sitting in his chest like stones. The air inside the cabin felt stiller than before, as if the canyon itself had stopped breathing. He reached for the metal box. Ranger stiffened, leaning forward just enough to place his nose near the lid. Then he froze. Not in fear, in recognition. The same recognition that had once stopped them both from opening a booby-trapped crate overseas. Elias paused, instincts prickling. The box was heavy, colder than it should have been. He checked the latches carefully. No tripwire, no hidden tension, just age. He opened it. Inside were 6 vials wrapped in cloth, each labeled with dates and coordinates. Samples of water, soil, sediment. Their colors were wrong, clouded, metallic. One had a shimmer at the bottom that looked almost alive. Beneath them lay a folded map. He pulled it out slowly. Ranger watched every movement, muscles trembling faintly with readiness. Elias spread the map on the dusty floor. Red ink circled several points across the canyon, joined by lines that formed a path that ended exactly where he was sitting. The cabin had been a destination, not a shelter. A sudden gust of wind slammed into the side of the cabin, rattling the window panes. Ranger snapped toward the sound, growling low, the kind of growl that made Elias reach instinctively for the rifle leaning by the door. But something else caught Ranger's attention. He lowered his head, sniffed deeply near the cracks in the floorboards. Elias frowned. What now? Ranger stepped back from the hearth and sat, tail rigid, gaze fixed not on the door, not on the window, but on the dark beneath the floor. Then he barked. One single, sharp command. Elias froze. Ranger had only ever barked that way when he needed him to stop, when danger had moved from suspicion to certainty. Elias crouched again, pressing a hand to the boards. And there it was, a faint vibration, steady, mechanical, like an engine idling far beyond the ridge. Someone was out there, someone who knew this cabin better than he did, someone who had reason to return now that he had pulled the stone from the wall. Elias reached for the flashlight again. Ranger moved closer, shoulder brushing Elias's leg, steadying him. You were right, Elias murmured. You felt this before I did. Ranger didn't look away from the floor. 3 seconds later, the engine sound cut abruptly. No fading, no retreat, just silence swallowing itself whole. Elias's pulse kicked. That meant whoever was out there had turned it off intentionally. Close enough to listen, close enough to approach. He gathered the notebooks, the vials, the map, tucking them back into the metal box. Ranger stayed poised beside him, posture sharp enough to slice through the dark. Outside, snow began to fall again, soft but relentless. The canyon was sealing itself, as if trying to bury the truth before Elias could understand it. Ranger pressed his head briefly into Elias's hand, grounding him again. Elias nodded once. This cabin hadn't been abandoned. It had been left behind. And Ranger had just awakened the one secret someone had spent 18 years trying to keep dead. Snow came early in Red Canyon, not gently but with a kind of deliberate force, as if the land wanted everything covered before anyone could look too closely. By morning, the cabin's windows were rimmed with frost, and the sky had swallowed the last traces of dawn. Elias sat at the table with the journals spread open before him, Ranger lying beside his chair, alert even in stillness. The words on the pages looked like the handwriting of a man who'd started out careful, and then realized caution no longer mattered. The first entries were clinical: measurements, coordinates, soil density. Then the tone shifted, angles hardened, ink pressed deeper. August 2nd water sample shows arsenic levels spiking again. This is no natural seep. Redcrest Minerals has another truck running the ridgeline after dark. August 11th. They drained something into the ravine. The foxes are dying. The creek has a metallic sheen. No one will talk to me. August 14th, Sheriff told me I'm imagining things. He said the canyon swallows stories. Maybe it does, but it spits up the truth eventually. Elias felt a chill settle under his skin. Red Crest. He remembered hearing the name on local radio reports in another state. A mining and extraction company with deep pockets and deeper secrets. The kind that buried problems with silence and lawyers. If they were dumping waste into this canyon, it wasn't incompetence. It was intent. He flipped to the last half-filled page. August 22. If someone is reading this, follow the marks. I left them where the canyon breathes. They won't see what a dog can find. Elias reread that line twice. They won't see what a dog can find. He looked down at Ranger. The dog was already staring at him. Not at the journal. At him. As if he understood something had just shifted. You saw that, didn't you? Elias whispered. Ranger stood. Not abruptly, with purpose. He moved to the cabin's back wall, nose low, tail stiff. He sniffed the boards, pressing his weight into the corner where two logs met. Then he pawed once. Quiet. Precise. It wasn't random. It was direction. Elias grabbed his jacket and followed Ranger to the door. The wind cut through the frame as soon as he opened it, bringing with it a swirl of snow and the faint, echoing howl of distant cliffs. Ranger didn't hesitate. He stepped out into the powder, nose working the air, body tense but controlled. Elias scanned the ridge behind the cabin. The red stone walls towered above them, streaked with snow and shadows. A narrow trail cut upward along the cliffside, barely visible beneath the drifts. Ranger headed straight for it. Hold up, Elias said out of instinct, but Ranger didn't wait. He glanced back once, a brief check, then pushed forward again. This wasn't stubbornness. This was the same steady confidence he had used overseas when he picked up a scent that didn't belong. Elias followed. They climbed the ridge, boots sinking into the snow with a muffled crunch. The canyon wind pushed at Elias's back, carrying with it a whistle that echoed off the rock like a voice trapped in stone. Ranger kept a steady pace, pausing only to test the air or study the rock face with intense focus. Halfway up the ridge, he stopped. His head swung toward a narrow seam in the cliff, barely the width of a man's shoulders. Snow had gathered there, but beneath it Elias saw faint scratches along the stone. Not animal, human, markings carved deliberately. A pattern. Elias brushed the snow aside. Miles had carved small arrows, barely noticeable unless you knew exactly where to look. "You found his trail," Elias murmured. Ranger nosed the entrance, sniffed deep, then pulled back slightly. Not fear. Assessment. Ranger had always checked for air movement, gases, anything that might signal danger. Elias watched him, trusting that old battlefield logic to guide them. The seam in the rock opened into a shallow passage. Cold air drifted out, carrying a smell Elias couldn't quite place. Metallic. Damp. Wrong. Ranger stepped inside first, tail low, muscles braced for whatever waited. Elias followed, one hand on the cliff wall to steady himself. The passage widened into a small alcove carved by erosion and time. Snow couldn't reach here. The ground was bare rock, and on that rock lay a small stack of stones arranged in a shape that didn't look natural. A cairn. Elias crouched. Someone had placed it deliberately. Beneath it a few scraps of paper, half decayed but legible enough. Ranger growled softly. Elias lifted the top stone and unfolded the moist paper beneath. Words bled into each other, but the message remained. Red Crest transports waste at night. North Ridge Pit. They burn the barrels at the old survey shaft. The water is dying. So will anyone who speaks. Elias swallowed hard. The canyon felt suddenly smaller, the air thinner. He rubbed his thumb across the fading ink. Ranger's ears snapped upward toward the trail they had just climbed. His body stiffened. He stepped forward, placing himself between Elias and the entrance. Elias stood fast. "What do you hear?" A second later, the sound reached him. A faint crunch. Snow displaced by weight. But not Ranger's. Not his. Someone else was out there. Elias flicked off his flashlight. Ranger lowered himself into a crouch, muscles trembling with controlled tension. The wind moaned again through the canyon, but it wasn't enough to cover the footsteps. They weren't moving toward the alcove. They were pacing, watching, waiting. Elias slowly reached for the knife at his belt, though he knew Ranger was the better weapon in this moment. The dog's breath was steady, his gaze locked on the entrance. Another step. Closer this time. Elias pressed his back to the stone wall, heart hammering. Then the footsteps stopped. Silence rushed in. A moment later, the crunch of snow retreated, moving up the ridge. Whoever had been there was leaving, but not in a hurry. They had come to check something, and they had chosen not to approach. Elias exhaled, tension leaving his shoulders in a slow roll. Ranger kept staring at the entrance long after the sound faded. Elias folded the paper from the cairn and tucked it into his pocket. "We're not imagining this," he whispered. "Someone is still coming up here. Someone still guarding something." He looked down at Ranger. "And you're the only reason we found any of it." Ranger stepped closer, nudging Elias's hand once before turning towards the trail again. Outside, the wind picked up, sweeping through Red Canyon with a sound like a warning wrapped in cold air. The red cliffs loomed over them, ancient and silent, but Elias could feel it now. The canyon wasn't empty. It wasn't forgotten. It was holding something, and Ranger was leading him straight into the heart of it. Redstone Township looked like every forgotten desert town Elias had ever passed through. One gas pump, one diner, one sheriff's office with a flag that flapped half-heartedly in the icy wind. He parked out front, Ranger hopping down beside him with a soft thud, already scanning the street with that familiar, disciplined vigilance. Inside, The sheriff's office smelled like burnt coffee and floor polish. Sheriff Dalton looked up from his desk, a practiced smile pulling at his face. He was in his late 50s, heavy-set, thinning blonde hair combed so carefully it almost dared the wind to try anything. His badge gleamed. His eyes did not. "What can I do for you, Mr. Ward?" he asked, leaning back in his chair as if he had all the time in the world. Elias didn't sit. Ranger didn't blink. "I found something in the cabin I bought," Elias said. "Something that doesn't look right. A journal. A name you'll know. Miles Keaton." Dalton's smile didn't falter, but something flickered behind his eyes. Recognition, quickly smothered. Keaton. Now there's a name I haven't heard in a while. Dalton drawled. Poor guy got himself lost in the canyon. Weather gets rough, people make mistakes. Happens more often than you'd think. He talked like he was reading off a script. Too smooth, too quick. Ranger stepped closer to Elias, body angled toward Dalton. His posture changed subtly, the way it had overseas when Elias spoke to someone whose story didn't match their heartbeat. Ranger wasn't aggressive, just locked in. Dalton noticed. "Easy there, boy," he said, chuckling lightly. "You train him to stare through people like that." "He does it on his own," Elias replied. Dalton's smile tightened. Then he started asking questions. Too many, too precise. "Where exactly did you find these notebooks? Did anyone else know you were headed up there? You tell anybody in town yet? You open that metal box?" Elias studied him. Every question felt less like concern and more like reconnaissance. Like Dalton wasn't trying to help him file a report. He was taking inventory. The sheriff leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk. "Look, son, cabins around here have all kinds of junk in them. Hunters leave things behind. Folks passing through stash supplies. You sure you're not misreading an old story someone wrote down? People get spooked alone in the canyon. Shadows play tricks." Elias didn't answer. Ranger's ears pinned tighter, chest vibrating with a low, contained sound that never quite became a growl. Dalton's eyes flicked to the dog again. Something cold settled in them. Elias turned to leave. If Dalton had more to say, he didn't say it. He just watched them walk out with that same pleasant, dead smile. Outside, the air felt sharper, the wind colder. Ranger walked at Elias's side, every muscle alert. Elias rested a hand on the dog's shoulder. "You felt it too, didn't you?" he murmured. Ranger bumped his head lightly against Elias's leg. Yes, he felt it. By the time the truck's tires hit the canyon road again, Elias's mind was running faster than the engine. Dalton hadn't been surprised about Miles Keaton. He had been prepared. And fear wasn't what Elias had sensed in the man. It was annoyance. Someone had opened a door they expected to stay shut. Snow began to fall harder by the time Elias reached the cabin. Ranger jumped out before the truck fully stopped, landing silently, scanning the tree line. Elias grabbed the notebooks, the metal box, and the map from the passenger seat, and hurried inside. He locked the door. Then he locked it again. Ranger paced once, then settled near the hearth, eyes locked on the window facing the ridge. Elias opened the second journal and tried to read, but the words never settled long enough to form meaning. His mind kept replaying Dalton's smile. The man had been too calm, too certain. Night fell like a curtain. Wind ripped through the canyon, catching the edges of the cabin and making them groan. Elias added wood to the fire, shadows jumping across the walls. Ranger didn't move. Then he stiffened. Not a freeze, a brace. The kind he used when danger was close enough to breathe. Elias held still, heart thudding. Ranger's gaze cut toward the far wall, then to the window. His hackles lifted slowly. Then they heard it. A crunch of snow. Controlled. Slow. Someone moving with intention. Ranger stepped forward, nose close to the floor, tracing something with quiet precision. Elias reached for the rifle, leaning beside the door. The metal felt cold, unfamiliar after months of not touching it. Another sound, metal tapping lightly against metal. Not loud, but close. Too close. Ranger's body dropped into a stalking posture, shoulders tight, breath held. His gaze tracked the movement like a sniper reading a shot. Elias killed the lantern. The cabin plunged into dim firelight. Outside, the footsteps moved, circling. The wind couldn't hide the rhythm. 3 steps. Pause. 4 more. Snow shifting under boots that didn't want to be heard. Elias's pulse hammered. Someone was scouting the perimeter. Someone who knew exactly where to walk without snapping branches. Someone trained. Ranger bared his teeth. Silent. Deadly. Elias whispered, "Stay with me." But Ranger wasn't looking at the window anymore. He'd turned toward the back corner of the cabin. The place where, hours earlier, he had detected the faint mechanical vibration beneath the floor. Another step outside. Closer. Almost at the door. Elias raised the rifle, and then the footsteps stopped. Silence bloomed. Heavy. Intentional. Whoever was out there wasn't leaving. They weren't approaching either. They were listening. Ranger didn't break his stance. His breath was slow, controlled. Elias knew that look. The canyon wasn't just holding secrets anymore. Someone had come to take them back. Elias waited, finger tense on the trigger, listening with every nerve sharpened. Then, deep in the canyon, a metallic clang echoed. Not from footsteps, from a truck door slamming shut. An engine roared to life, muffled by snow. Tires spun. Then the sound faded into the night. Ranger stayed rigid for another full minute before he finally let out a shaky exhale and pressed against Elias's leg. Elias knelt, resting a hand on the dog's side. Ranger's muscles trembled under his palm. They weren't being watched. They were being measured. And whoever had been out there knew exactly what Elias had found. The canyon wasn't silent anymore. It was awake. Morning came gray and cold, the kind of light that didn't warm anything, only revealed it. Elias stepped outside with Ranger close beside him. Snow had settled in uneven drifts along the ridge, and the air carried the sharp, metallic bite of winter, tightening its grip on Red Canyon. Ranger led, nose low, tail straight, his steps precise, as if following a map only he could smell. Elias trusted him without hesitation. The dog wasn't wandering, he was tracking something with intent. They reached the backside of the cabin where the cliff face rose at a steep angle, scarred by decades of wind. Ranger stopped abruptly, ears twitching, and began digging. Fast, powerful strokes that sent snow and gravel flying. Not frantic, purposeful. Elias crouched beside him. "What is it?" Ranger didn't look up. He kept pawing at a thin seam in the rock, a fissure barely visible beneath a layer of frost. When the debris cleared enough, Elias leaned closer. The crack ran deeper than it looked, forming a narrow slit barely wide enough for a man to squeeze through. Ranger stepped back and stared at Elias, chest heaving with controlled intensity. "You want me to look," Elias breathed. He pulled out his flashlight and aimed the beam into the fissure. The light stretched down a short corridor of uneven stone that opened into a shallow alcove. Inside, the dirt was disturbed. Not recently, but not ancient either. Someone had sheltered here. Someone had waited. Along the wall, Elias spotted a scrap of fabric, sun-faded and filthy, a torn sleeve from a jacket. Near it, a rusted tin cup. And beside that, grooves in the stone floor, marks from boots pacing back and forth in a confined space. Miles Keaton hadn't died instantly. He had hidden here. He had run. Or more likely, he had been hunted. Elias took a breath and let the cold settle in his lungs. He lifted the scrap of fabric, turning it over in his hand. Ranger stepped closer, sniffing it gently, then let out a quiet rumble. Recognition, not aggression. The scent was human, long gone, but still present in the stone. The canyon didn't forget. Elias unfolded one of the journals he had carried in his pack, flipping to the page he kept thinking about. I am being watched. The badge smiles before it bites. They want me gone. They want the canyon clean of memory. He read the lines under his breath. Ranger's ears perked at the tone, the way they always had when Elias's voice carried weight. Another entry. If they find this place, they'll finish what they started. But if a dog finds it first, maybe the truth survives. Elias looked back at Ranger, a slow understanding settling in. Miles Keaton didn't trust the law. He didn't trust neighbors. He didn't trust friends. The only thing he believed might uncover his truth was an animal who couldn't be bribed, threatened, or fooled. And Ranger, somehow impossibly, was following the same path Keaton once walked. Wind cut through the alcove, carrying a low whistle that echoed off the rock walls. Elias felt the canyon watching them again with its old, unblinking gaze. He stepped back from the fissure and scanned the ridgeline. Yesterday's footprints around the cabin were half covered by snow now, but some edges still held shape. More than one person, one heavier, one lighter. Not random wanderers, a team. Dalton had known, or at least suspected. His questions at the office replayed in Elias's mind, his too-easy smile, the way he had repeated certain words, fishhooking for details. Someone had been circling the cabin, someone waiting for a mistake. Ranger returned to Elias's side, pressing against him lightly. Elias looked down at the dog's steady brown eyes. The same look Ranger had given him countless times overseas when they stood at a crossroads, and the wrong choice meant someone wouldn't make it home. "You think we should keep going?" Elias said quietly. Ranger lifted his head and rested it firmly on Elias's hand. A simple gesture. The same one he used in Afghanistan when Elias hesitated before breaching a room. A signal, a reassurance. "We go forward." Elias breathed slow. He scanned the canyon again. Snow fell in slow drifts, muting sound and light. This place wanted him small, wanted him uncertain. But the weight of what he had found was too much to ignore. He knelt beside Ranger, fingers curling into the thick fur along the dog's neck. "If we keep digging, someone is going to push back harder," he whispered. "They already have." Ranger didn't move. Elias let the truth settle. He could leave. He could take Ranger, the journals, the samples, and vanish from the canyon before nightfall. Drive east until Red Crest's shadow faded in the rearview mirror. He wasn't obligated to fight battles that weren't his. But someone had been poisoned here. Something had been buried here. Miles Keaton had died alone, trying to expose it. And the only reason his voice survived was because a dog had found the trail. Ranger pressed closer, his head sliding against Elias's ribs with the quiet strength of someone offering his own resolve. "All right," Elias murmured. "Then we stay, and we finish what he started." A sudden crack echoed above them. A rock shifted and tumbled down the cliff, landing 10 feet from where they stood. Elias tensed and grabbed Ranger by the collar, pulling him back into the shadow of the alcove. He scanned the ridgeline. Snow drifted, wind hissed, no figure appeared, no sound followed. But Elias knew that fall wasn't natural. The timing was too sharp, too well placed. They weren't alone on the ridge. This was the rift, the moment where safety ended and choice began. Elias tightened his grip on Ranger and whispered, more to himself than to the dog, "We're already in it, aren't we?" Ranger's tail lowered, but his eyes stayed sharp. Yes, they were in it. Together, they stepped out of the alcove and faced the canyon, the cold slicing across their faces. The land stretched before them, ancient and silent, but Elias could feel it now in his bones. Someone wanted this story dead, and someone else, long gone but not forgotten, had left a trail for a soldier and a dog to follow. Elias touched Ranger's head once more. Then he made the choice. We keep going. The night had gone unnaturally still, the kind of silence that presses against the cabin walls like a warning. Elias lay in his sleeping bag near the fire pit, eyes half open, listening to the soft rhythm of Ranger's breathing. Beside him, snow whispered against the windows. Wind curled around the eaves in slow, tired drags. Then Ranger snapped awake. His body went rigid first. Muscles flexed tight, ears angled sharply toward the door. His breath slowed, his pupils widened. It was the posture Elias knew too well, the stance the dog took seconds before an IED sweep went bad overseas. "What is it, boy?" Ranger didn't look at him. He stared at the front door, unmoving. A sound followed, barely audible, a faint metallic tick. Then another. Someone testing the knob, someone trying not to be heard. Elias shot upright. Ranger growled once, a single deep vibration from the chest, unmistakable. Warning, not fear. Elias reached for the pistol he kept beside his pack, but the decision came too late. The door exploded inward. A man in dark tactical gear surged through the opening, rifle raised. Ranger launched himself forward with the force of a battering ram, slamming into the attacker's legs. The man fired as he fell, the muzzle flash lighting the cabin in a brutal white glare. The bullet tore through the doorframe, inches from Elias's shoulder. "Move!" Elias yelled, diving behind the overturned chair. Ranger lunged again, teeth clamped around the man's wrist, jerking the rifle off aim. Another shot rang out, hitting the ceiling. A second attacker smashed through the side window, boots crunching over glass. A third silhouette crossed the porch outside. They weren't amateurs, they weren't drifters. They were trained, and they knew exactly where to strike. Ranger held his grip, dragging the first intruder across the floor with a snarl that shook the walls. The man shouted, trying to wrench free, but Ranger didn't yield an inch. Elias fired one round toward the broken window, forcing the second attacker to duck. Then came the shattering crash of glass from behind him. A bottle arced through the window and burst against the far wall. Fire bloomed instantly, racing up the curtains. Another bottle hit the floor. Flames roared across the cabin like a living thing hungry for oxygen after years of waiting. "They're burning us out," Elias realized. Heat surged. Smoke filled the room in seconds. The wooden beams groaned overhead. Ranger released the first attacker only when the man jammed a knee into the dog's ribs and twisted out of his jacket. The intruder bolted for the window, stumbling over the broken frame. A voice shouted from outside, "Move! Leave it! We're lighting the whole place!" Elias heard boots retreating. Someone sprinted through the snow, breath ragged. Elias scrambled forward and grabbed Ranger by the collar. "We have to get out." But Ranger didn't follow him. The dog turned back toward Elias's pack on the table, the pack containing the journals, the metal case, and every piece of evidence Miles Keaton had died protecting. Ranger barked once, sharp and powerful, then leapt through the fire-lit haze toward the table. Ranger, no. The roof cracked above them. Elias lunged after him. He slung the satchel over his shoulder just as a burning beam crashed to the floor where he had been standing seconds earlier. Ranger pressed himself against Elias's leg, pushing him toward the back door. Not guiding. Forcing. Go. Smoke thickened until Elias could barely open his eyes. His lungs burned. Heat wrapped around him like a tightening fist. Ranger rammed the back door with his shoulder. Once, twice. The wooden frame splintered on the third hit. Elias kicked it open the rest of the way and stumbled out into the snow, collapsing onto the frozen ground. Cold air seared his lungs. He coughed hard, dragging in breath after breath. "Where's Ranger?" Then he saw him. The dog staggered through the burning doorway, left side singed black, fur curled and smoking. He stumbled, caught himself, and pushed forward until he collapsed beside Elias in the snow. Elias scrambled toward him, hands shaking. Ranger's chest heaved, each breath a struggle. He didn't whine, he didn't cry. He just watched Elias with steady eyes, as if checking that he had made it out alive. Elias pressed his jacket against the burn, voice breaking. "You idiot! You brave, stupid idiot!" Behind them, the cabin collapsed in a thunderous roar. Sparks shot into the night sky. The flames climbed high, consuming everything inside that Redcrest wanted erased. Everything, except the evidence Ranger had dragged Elias toward. A shadow moved at the tree line. One of the attackers, masked, limping. He paused just long enough to look back at the blaze. Then he spoke, voice shaking from adrenaline. "Burn the evidence. Redcrest won't let the canyon speak again." He disappeared into the dark. Elias stared after him, frozen. The canyon wasn't cursed. The silence wasn't superstition. It was manufactured, controlled, protected by men who burned homes and hunted witnesses and buried truth under rock and fear. He looked down at Ranger. The dog lifted his head and rested it weakly on Elias's knee. "We're not done," Elias whispered. Ranger closed his eyes, but his tail moved once, slow and certain. Not done at all. The flames crackled behind them. Smoke curled upward. Snow began to fall. And somewhere in the darkness, Redcrest's men regrouped, thinking they had erased the last piece of Miles Keaton's discovery. But they had underestimated one thing: a dog who refused to let the canyon go silent. Dawn broke cold and colorless over Red Canyon. The sky washed in gray like the world itself was holding its breath. Elias crouched beside Ranger on the ridge, tightening the fresh bandage across the dog's scorched flank. Ranger didn't flinch. He hadn't flinched once since the fire. His eyes stayed fixed on the tree line, watching, guarding, refusing to rest even as pain tightened the muscles along his ribs. "Easy, bud. Just a little longer." Ranger finally looked at him, a slow, measured blink. Not weakness, permission. Elias exhaled and reached into his satchel, pulling out the contents that had nearly cost them their lives. Miles Keaton's journals, the hand-drawn maps, the soil and water samples, the metal military case filled with vials that rattled softly in the morning chill. He powered on his satellite communicator, fingers stiff from the cold. Only one person he trusted with something this big, someone who wouldn't fold under pressure or look the other way for the sake of local politics. Marley Ruiz. They had served together during Elias's early years in Afghanistan, before Marley left the military and made a name for herself in investigative journalism. She'd taken down 2 corporations already. She wasn't afraid of cliffs, fire, or men with expensive lawyers. Elias recorded a voice note, low and steady. "Marley, it's Ward. I found something. Evidence of environmental contamination. Possible homicide. Sending files now. Need your eyes on this. And watch your back. Redcrest is involved." He attached photos of the journals, scans of the maps, and detailed images of each vial. Data dumped through the satellite uplink in bursts of green progress bars. Behind him, Ranger stiffened again, ears angling towards the west ridge. Nothing moved in the trees, but Elias didn't need proof. Ranger sensed things before they existed in the world, before danger took shape, before men with guns decided how bold they felt. "Still watching for them, huh?" Elias murmured. Ranger didn't look away. 30 minutes later, the communicator vibrated. "Incoming call. Marley Ruiz." Elias answered immediately. "Where are you?" Marley's voice cut through the static, sharp and alert. "I just got your files and Ward. Tell me straight. Is this real?" "All of it," Elias said. "I saw what they did to the cabin. They tried to burn it down with us inside. There was a pause. Not hesitation, calculation. Miles Keaton went missing 18 years ago, she said. You're telling me he found proof of contamination this severe, and they buried him for it? He didn't bury himself, Elias replied. Ranger lifted his head slightly, listening. Marley's tone dropped. Ward, these samples, these levels are criminal. Arsenic, cadmium, benzene. This isn't negligence. This is intentional dumping. And the reports you sent were doctored. They didn't even try to hide the shortcuts. What about the names in Keaton's journal? Already checking them. Marley inhaled sharply. One of them is a county water inspector. 2 others are city zoning officials. And Sheriff Dalton. His signature shows up on multiple Red Crest access permits. Elias closed his eyes. He had known, but hearing it solidified something hard in his chest. Red Crest has been paying off half the county. Marley continued. If this breaks open, it'll be federal. Good, Elias said. A chopper in the distance startled a flock of birds from the canyon wall. Ranger followed the sound, body tense, but Elias placed a hand on his back. Not them, bud. Marley exhaled in his ear. Ward, listen to me. I'm sending everything to EPA's Special Investigations Unit and DOJ's Environmental Crimes Task Force. This is going up the ladder fast. But until they arrive, you need to stay alive, and keep that dog alive. This entire case hinges on what you 2 carried out of that cabin. Ranger stood then, pushing himself up despite the pain, and stepped between Elias and the open ridge. He planted his feet, tail low but steady, ears forward, watching the canyon like it was a battlefield. He knows, Elias whispered. He always knows. Marley's voice softened. That dog has more sense than half the people in Washington. Oof. Ranger didn't turn, but Elias could feel something shift. Pride, maybe. Or resolve. Send me your coordinates, Marley said. I'll forward them to the federal teams. They're going to want to secure your location. Elias did. Then he ended the call and let the silence return. Snow drifted lightly around them, each flake catching in Ranger's fur. Elias rested a hand on the dog's shoulders. Ranger leaned in slightly, the weight steady and grounding. We're close, Elias murmured. Closer than anyone's been in years. Ranger's gaze stayed locked ahead, but his breathing slowed, a calm settling over him that Elias recognized from their military days. Ranger was in guarding mode now, not tense, ready. The canyon seemed to hold its breath with them. Miles Keaton hadn't died for nothing. His words, his samples, his maps. They were alive again, moving, heading toward people who could turn whispers into indictments. Elias tightened his coat and stood beside Ranger, both of them facing the tree line where danger had come from, and where it would come from again. Behind them, the charred remains of the cabin smoldered faintly beneath the snow. Ahead of them, for the first time since Elias had stepped into Red Canyon, the horizon looked like a door cracking open. Justice was coming, because a soldier refused to run, because a journalist's voice refused to die, and because a dog, burned and bruised, still stood guard between truth and the people who wanted it buried. The storm broke without warning, not the kind that tore through cabins and set treetops swaying, but the kind that arrived on rotor blades and government plates, announcing itself with authority instead of thunder. Elias and Ranger watched from the ridge as the first helicopter banked low over Red Canyon, its searchlight slicing across the snow like a white-hot blade. A second chopper followed, then a third. Down on the valley floor, SUVs crawled up the narrow trail, engines growling against the cold. Men and women in DOJ jackets and EPA field gear spilled out, moving with the kind of certainty Elias hadn't seen since his deployments overseas. This wasn't rumor anymore. This wasn't a lone veteran and a wounded K-9 fighting ghosts in the dark. The cavalry had arrived. Ranger shifted next to him, weight leaning slightly against Elias's leg. He was still, healing, but steady on his paws. Agent Ramirez from DOJ was the first to spot them on the ridge. She lifted a hand and motioned for 2 tactical officers to hold their ground as Elias and Ranger descended. "You made quite a mess down here," she called, voice carrying easily through the thin morning air. Elias didn't smile. Not yet. Behind her, 2 agents guided a man in cuffs toward a waiting vehicle. Sheriff Dalton. His badge was gone, his hat missing, his face pale beneath the canyon light. He looked at Elias only once. It wasn't anger in his eyes. It wasn't fear. It was something closer to resignation, the kind a man feels when a secret he's guarded for half a lifetime is finally dragged into daylight. Ranger stood tall at Elias's side, ears forward, gaze locked on Dalton with the same quiet, surgical focus he used when sweeping a building in Afghanistan. Dalton's throat bobbed. "He knows," the sheriff muttered under his breath. Damn dog knew the whole time. Elias didn't answer. 2 EPA specialists broke open the evidence crates, lifting vials, scanning labels, laying out Keaton's journals like sacred relics on portable tables. The canyon filled with murmurs, shock, disbelief, anger. One of the scientists looked up from a soil sample, her expression paling. "Levels like this aren't negligence," she whispered. "This is criminal." Agent Ramirez nodded. "That's why we're here." Marley Ruiz jogged over, scarf flapping behind her. She looked exhausted but triumphant, eyes bright with the rush of a journalist watching truth take its first breath in years. "You did good, Ward," she said. "Without this, Red Crest would have paved this canyon and called it progress." Ranger stepped forward, nudging her hand softly. Marley laughed under her breath. "Correction. You did good, soldier." Ranger's tail thumped once, a single, quiet acknowledgement. By mid-morning, the entire canyon had transformed. Federal drones mapped the ridge. Field teams drilled core samples. Photographers documented everything from the burned remains of Elias's cabin to the hidden fissure where Ranger had first alerted. Then the final vehicle arrived, a coroner's van. The mood shifted, softened. Silence spread through the canyon like a blanket. Agents gathered near the far ridge as 2 men with shovels uncovered a patch of disturbed earth marked on Keaton's map. Ranger walked beside Elias, slower now, each step deliberate. They stopped at the edge of the site. A black tarp rose from the soil. Confirmation came quietly. "It's him, Miles Keaton." Elias closed his eyes for a moment. Ranger leaned gently against him, a solid weight, a steady anchor. "He wasn't forgotten," Elias whispered. "He just needed someone to listen." Back at base camp, Agent Ramirez approached with forms and questions, but her voice softened as she glanced at Ranger. "We've got a K9 medical unit coming in. They'll take care of him." Ranger looked up at Elias as if asking whether he had permission. Elias crouched and placed a hand on his head. "Go on," he murmured. "You've earned it." Ranger walked toward the unit without hesitation, trusting the path Elias set for him. 2 medics knelt, cleaning the burns with warm saline, checking his ribs, bandaging carefully. Ranger didn't whine, didn't resist. He just watched Elias the entire time, eyes steady and calm. Hours passed. The canyon bustled with law enforcement and scientists, but the chaos never touched the ridge where Elias stood. He felt something uncoil in his chest, something knotted tight since the first bark in that cold cabin. It wasn't gone. It never would be. But it loosened. When he returned to the burned foundation of his cabin, snow had settled over the charred beams. Smoke no longer rose from the ashes. The canyon felt different now. Not haunted, not hunted, just quiet. Elias walked the perimeter, boots crunching softly. The air smelled like cedar and cold rock. He stopped where the fireplace used to be, the same place Ranger had stood rigid, hackles raised, warning him. Miles Keaton's truth had been buried here. Now it was free. 3 weeks later, Elias rebuilt the cabin. Not the same. Better, stronger. Cedar beams, a stone hearth, windows positioned to watch the canyon the way Ranger always did. Each board he hammered in carried weight. Memory, purpose. It wasn't a hideout anymore. It was a monument to Miles Keaton, to truth, to a shepherd who refused to let silence win. Ranger lay on the new porch, bandages gone, fur slowly growing back over the burned patch. His breathing was slow and even, but his eyes stayed open, scanning the tree line, listening to the canyon's whispering wind. Elias stepped beside him with a mug of coffee and lowered himself to sit. "Still guarding?" he asked. Ranger blinked once, the same slow, deliberate way he did back in Afghanistan when the world was dangerous but manageable. Elias looked out across the canyon, watching the sun climb the cliffs Miles once walked. Federal crews were still working the site, but the land no longer felt poisoned. It felt like it could breathe again. Just like him. Just like Ranger. Quiet had finally come. Not empty. Healing. The kind that stays. The morning sun washed over Red Canyon in a soft, amber glow, warming the cedar porch boards beneath Elias's boots. The rebuilt cabin stood quiet and proud behind him, every beam hammered with purpose, every stone laid with memory. Ranger lay at his side, older now. His coat had grown back in uneven patches over the burned scars, a rough reminder of the night the canyon tried to swallow them whole. But his eyes were still sharp, still watchful, still Ranger. A dust cloud rose from the trail below. Elias shaded his eyes and saw a school van rumbling up the gravel path, bouncing gently as it climbed. He had been warned they were coming, but he still felt something in his chest tighten. He wasn't used to being the one people asked for, especially not kids. The van stopped. Doors slid open. A dozen students spilled out onto the ridge, bundled in jackets and scarves, their breath fogging the air. Their teacher, a woman in her 30s with a clipboard tucked under her arm, led them forward. "Mr. Ward?" she called. Elias nodded. "Yes, ma'am." The students gathered around the porch steps like they were approaching a living legend instead of a man who still woke up some nights in a cold sweat. Ranger pushed himself up onto his elbows, ears perked, nose twitching at the unfamiliar scents. The teacher gestured toward him, and that must be Ranger. A ripple of awe went through the group. One boy whispered, "That's the dog from the news." Ranger rose to his feet. Slow, deliberate, proud. He stepped forward until he was beside Elias, chest broad, stance steady. A soldier presenting himself. Elias rested a hand on his neck. "He won't bite," he said quietly. "But he knows when someone's lying, so don't try it." The kids laughed nervously, unsure if he was joking. The teacher turned to them. "All right, who wants to start?" Hands flew up. A girl with freckles and a notebook nearly bursting with papers was chosen first. She stepped forward, eyes wide. "Sir, why did you buy a cabin out here? Everyone says this place was cursed." Elias let out a slow breath. "It wasn't cursed," he said. "It was forgotten. There's a difference." Ranger sat at his feet, tail wrapped tight along the boards. Another student, a boy with a cracked voice and oversized glasses, raised his hand. "Is it true you fought off a whole squad of armed men with nothing but your dog?" Elias resisted the urge to laugh. "Not exactly," he said. "Ranger did the fighting. I did the surviving." Ranger flicked an ear, unimpressed with the summary. More hands rose. The questions came quickly. "How did you find the journals? How did Miles Keaton know the truth? Did you know Sheriff Dalton was involved? Were you scared? Do you think Red Crest will come back?" Elias answered each one, careful and steady. Not with drama, not with heroism, just with truth. Raw and unfiltered. Then the smallest girl in the group stepped forward. She couldn't have been more than 12. Her notebook was blank. Her voice was soft. "Mr. Ward, I have just one question." Elias leaned forward slightly. "Go ahead." She looked at Ranger first. Really looked, the way someone looks at a piece of history still walking the earth. Why did Ranger find that hidden stone when no one else did? Silence fell over the group. Even the wind seemed to pause. Elias looked down at Ranger. The dog met his gaze, eyes dark and aware, as if he understood every syllable. The truth sat heavy on Elias's tongue. Not complicated, not fancy, just painfully simple. He knelt beside Ranger, fingers brushing the fur along the dog's scarred shoulder. He wasn't looking for danger, Elias said quietly. He was looking for what was left behind. The students stood still, breath held. Elias continued. Dogs like him remember things we forget. What we walk past, they sit with. What we bury, they dig up. He didn't smell danger that night. He smelled a man trying to be heard. Ranger shifted closer, leaning his weight against Elias's thigh. A gentle nudge, a grounding touch. The girl whispered, "Miles Keaton?" Elias nodded. Ranger didn't find a clue. He found a story that wasn't done telling itself. A few students wiped their eyes, pretending the wind had gotten to them. The teacher cleared her throat softly. Would it be all right if we took a photo with him? Elias glanced at Ranger. Ranger made the decision first. He stood and stepped forward, positioning himself in the center of the group like he'd done this 1,000 times. The kids clustered around him, but none reached out until Ranger gently nudged one girl's hand with his nose. Permission granted. The shutter clicked. The moment froze in time. A veteran rebuilt from ashes, a dog carved from loyalty, and a group of children learning that truth doesn't vanish just because someone buries it deep enough. As the van loaded up and the students waved goodbye, the smallest girl lingered at the door. She looked back at Elias and Ranger, voice quiet but steady. "Thank you for listening when nobody else did." Elias didn't speak. He simply lifted a hand. Ranger watched until the van disappeared behind the ridge, tail curling around his paws. The canyon fell quiet again, but not empty. Elias looked at Ranger. "You still guarding the story, old friend?" Ranger blinked once. Slow, certain. The kind of blink that carried 18 years of a stranger's truth and a lifetime of service no medal could ever name. Elias stood and faced the cliffs where Miles Keaton had walked his final steps. Legacy wasn't a monument or a plaque. Legacy was a German shepherd who refused to let the canyon stay silent. The day faded slow over Red Canyon, the sky sinking into a deep crimson that bled across the stone cliffs. It was the kind of dusk that felt ancient, as if the canyon itself had seen 1,000 lifetimes and still kept watch. Elias stepped out onto the porch, the boards creaking softly beneath his boots. In his hand was a glass of whiskey. Not the cheap kind, the kind you save for something that mattered. Ranger lay on the top step, stretched long, chest rising in slow, deliberate breaths. His muzzle had grayed, his body had healed, though the fur along his ribs still grew in uneven patches. But he rested like a king tonight, stretched before a land that no longer hid secrets under its stones. Elias lowered himself beside him, shoulder brushing the dog's. Ranger made a small rumble in his chest, not quite a growl, not quite a sigh, a sound of acknowledgement, of presence. "You earned this quiet," Elias whispered. The canyon carried his voice, broke it gently against the cliffs, and sent it drifting back in softer echoes. A marker stood at the far edge of the yard, carved from local cedar. Miles Keaton, journalist, explorer, Truth teller. Someone had left wildflowers there that morning. Maybe one of the students, maybe a neighbor, maybe no one at all. Elias raised his glass toward it, to the man who wouldn't stay buried. A wind rose from the canyon floor, cool and steady, sliding across the porch like a breath from the earth itself. It threaded through the trees, rattled dry branches, hummed against the tin roof. In that moment, the canyon didn't feel empty. It felt awake, a place that had seen darkness but refused to stay in it. Ranger lifted his head, ears twitching as if the wind carried a voice only he could hear. His eyes were sharp again, reflecting the last streaks of dying sunlight. "Still listening to ghosts," Elias said softly. Ranger blinked once. The canyon wind washed over them again, curling under the porch, whistling through the stones. A whisper, a reminder, a promise. The camera on the tripod clicked on with its soft electronic hum. Elias had agreed to one last interview. Not a press conference, not a spotlight. A documentary crew had asked for a closing segment, something personal, something honest. He didn't want a script. He never had. He faced the lens, the canyon burning behind him like the world had caught fire and made peace with it. People ask why it was Ranger who found the stone. He began, voice low, steady. Why he sensed something before anyone else did. Why he stood in front of danger instead of behind it. He glanced down at the dog beside him. Ranger gazed up without moving his head, amber eyes warm in the dimming light. Elias looked back to the camera. "Some truths don't howl," he said. "They wait. They endure. They sit quiet in the dark until someone pays attention. And sometimes, a dog is the one who hears them first." He let the words settle. No music, no dramatic pause, just stillness. Ranger shifted, pushing his head against Elias's boot like he was confirming it himself. Elias reached down and rested his hand on the dog's neck, feeling the calm strength beneath the fur. This canyon was supposed to stay silent. Elias continued. It almost did. But one bark changed everything. One instinct, one moment, and the truth came back to life. The camera zoomed out slowly, framing Elias, Ranger, and the canyon swallowed in red light. The wind carried a final whisper through the stones, as if Miles Keaton himself lingered in the spaces between the cliffs. Elias turned his head slightly toward the lens, voice soft but firm. "Now I'm asking you something. What's your story with a loyal pet?" Ranger exhaled, long and warm, like a soldier finally letting down his guard. Elias added, quieter, almost a murmur, "Because here, in Red Canyon, we're still listening." The camera light blinked off. The canyon slipped deeper into dusk. Ranger lay his head across Elias's foot, eyes half closed, but alert enough to catch every shift in the breeze. Elias finished the last sip of whiskey, set the glass down beside him, and stared into the open space where day was folding into night. "If you believe stories like his matter," Elias said into the dark, more to the viewers than to himself, "then support German Shepherd. We keep these stories alive, for the dogs who guard us, for the truths they refuse to let die." Ranger didn't need words. The canyon had spoken, and he had listened first.